morning to you and good morning, everybody. We can get started then. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. 𝗛𝗆𝗀𝗿𝗀𝗀, National Hydrogen Economy Project Manager at PDO, who is going to be presenting to us on hydrogen hubs, creating the next steps to creating a value chain for hydrogen production, infrastructure, and utilization in Oman. We're going to have a presentation by Dr. 𝗛𝗆𝗀𝗀𝗀, and then hopefully we're going to have some time for a few questions and discussion there. The way to put your questions to Dr. 𝗛𝗆𝗀𝗀𝗀 will be through our chat room. I hope that you can all see that on your screens. You can just post your chats and post your questions as we go along, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can. We have the better part of half an hour for this session. So Dr. 𝗛𝗆𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀, if all is technically okay with you, I would like to hand over and welcome.
Thank you so much, Dalia, for the introduction. And thank you all for the time and for the patience. It's a pleasure to be here today, a continuation of the Oman Energy Forums over the last few years, and it's been so much successful. I truly look forward to present and discuss with you an interesting agenda today, which is on hydrogen hubs and what are the next steps to build a complete and integrated value chain for Oman that encompasses the production, infrastructure, and of course utilization, and hopefully for export. So inside the talk today, you'll hear about hydrogen in so many ways, in so many different shapes. So it's good that we keep all in mind that hydrogen, is it really a hype or a hope? Is it true? And where does Oman stand today? Are we standing and we're starting the journey from a position of strength so that we can build on easily, or we're really starting from zero? I'll also talk about some insights from the National Hydrogen Economy Feasibility Study that was done over the last 18 months or so. And then the prospect today, which is about establishing the hydrogen hubs in Oman. What are they? What is the concept? And how can it serve the agenda for energy transition? And of course, establishing new economies. And what are the next steps for integrated value chain? So this slide, it shows the rationale for the world to really start looking into the energies. And it shows that the demand in 2019 globally was around 144 million tons of oil equivalent. That's globally. And it's predominantly coming from coal, oil, and gas. That was in 2019. Now, there were so many scenarios published from the many countries around the world. And for the various scenarios, it shows different energy profile. The graph to the right shows 4 scenarios. For one, it shows the stated policy scenario. And the stated policy scenario is that some of the countries announced their policies to really recover from the COVID pandemic consequences and go back to pre-COVID time in 2021. So basically in this year. The delayed recovery scenario is that the global economies are really aspiring to recover and go back to pre-COVID in 2023. And there is a sustainable development scenario, which is that was published by the United Nations. So how the world will change in 2030. And there is the net zero emissions scenario by the second half of the century, that the 4th column you see to the right. The key messages in here compared to 2019. So the zero on the right figure shows the 2019 demand, which is 144 million tons of oil equivalent. And the delta that you see on the curves shows, whether, what is the change that we're expecting, or the world is expecting to see in the various energies, whether it's coal, oil, gas, nuclear, and so on and so forth. The key takeaway here is that the world sees in all the scenarios that renewables will pick up. You could see the light blue at the top of each bar. The renewables will pick up big time. And the world is seeing and forecasting that the demand on coal will get less and less for many reasons. But we could see that if the world is to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Scenario in 2030, the coal will have to be phased out big time. The demand for oil is expected also to go less because of electrification, EVs, and many other applications. So the message in here is that, for the world to ensure continuous energy access, decarbonization agenda, and competitive energy profiles, the focus should be more and more on renewables. Now, speaking about renewables, hydrogen features so much at the top of the agenda of renewables for many reasons, because hydrogen is believed to have a huge energy content in terms of energy content per unit mass, but also it can be shipped, transported to many countries globally. And thirdly, it can also decarbonize around 65% of the global emissions, throughout various applications. You could see that the bar on the left-hand side shows that the emissions of the CO2 equivalent per year, which is around 44 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year globally. So that's the emissions globally.
Dr. Abdallah, sorry, we just lost your two charts there as you were speaking. We can't see the charts anymore. Could you put them back up, possibly?
Okay, I will try to.
Because they're very useful, obviously, to look at while you're talking us through these figures. Great visuals. Let's see. Yep, they're back now. I see them.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me know. So why hydrogen is featuring so well in the renewables and the energy agenda is because of the many applications and the potential to substitute various applications, but also decarbonize the industrial system. So the bar that you see on the left-hand side, it shows the global emissions for the CO2, which is around 44 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, and the potential for hydrogen to really substitute a lot of these processes. You could see the columns colored in purple, the various shades of purple, whether it's for buildings, industry, transport, electricity, and heat. There's a lot of potential for hydrogen to really feature and substitute the current supplies. A lot of countries globally have announced strategies for hydrogen and have steps towards net zero by 2050. And that in their strategies, it is believed that hydrogen will play a big part as a fossil fuel replacement. So that's for number one. And then, of course, takes a central part in the circular economy through the CCU and CCS, so that's carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And of course, hydrogen can be and is believed to be a clean feedstock for energy, for oil refining, chemicals, and many other applications. Of course, for the fuel cell electric vehicles, the production of synthetic fuels, and the hydrogen can play a big part in the integration of renewables. So that's why, from the renewables that we've seen in the previous slide, hydrogen plays a big part in that transition. Now, moving on, as we speak about hydrogen, now it's stuck with me. So hydrogen has various definitions and depends on the production process and management. You could see 4 colors of hydrogen, and there are obviously more colors to this. So there is the gray hydrogen, which is the basic, the status quo of hydrogen, which is produced from natural gas, mainly, or from coal through gasification. So the gray hydrogen is, in simple terms, we get the natural gas and we crack it to produce the hydrogen. Of course, the resultant CO2 is emitted to the atmosphere. So that's the current most industry practice today. There is the blue hydrogen that still relies on natural gas, but the resultant CO2 gets captured and stored or utilized. So we don't basically emit the CO2 to the atmosphere. It's still gas-based or coal-based, but we capture the CO2 to a high percentage, 85 to 95%. There is the turquoise hydrogen, which once CO2 is captured, so still gas-based or coal-based, but once we capture the CO2, then we utilize the CO2 to produce the chemical value, like, for example, the solid carbon black that is so much used in various industries. So we capture it and we create some products that have value in the market, whereby it can offset a lot of the capture costs. There is obviously the green, and the green here does not rely at all on the fossil fuels or coal. So it is so much based on a technology called electrolysis. Electrolysis is a technology that uses water as a medium, and we split the water to hydrogen and oxygen, and obviously we get the hydrogen from there. So much relies on renewable energies, whether it's solar, wind, and obviously you could have many other applications of renewable energy, like for example the biofuels or the hydropower. So those basically are the main components of hydrogen. In Oman, we have industries that are so much based on the gray and to some extent the blue. And Oman is currently the third largest producer of hydrogen in the region. So that's already, Oman is already making some head start in the hydrogen business. If I move to the next slide. So this slide shows the landscape for hydrogen. And when we speak, how is the hydrogen and hydrogen strategy are shaping up and continue to shape up the global hydrogen or energy portfolios, but also the economic portfolios globally. Currently, there are 9, or at least as of February this year, 9 countries have already announced national strategies on hydrogen. So 9 countries, and further 11 countries are in the process of making one. So a total of 20 countries, as of the beginning of this year, were considering hydrogen as a key part in the energy portfolio. Those countries represent around 44% of the global GDP. So it's a really big club to be in and play a part in the energy portfolio. You could see Oman as one country that is, shaping up and preparing to launch the national hydrogen strategy. And it's a pioneer in the region. You could see that some other countries have already published their strategies, including Australia, for example, New Zealand, Chile, Japan, South Korea, and a few countries in the European bloc. Now, speaking about the supply and demand globally, we've talked about the picture is really promising, and we've talked about there is potential markets for supply, but also potential markets for demand. This slide shows the global hydrogen demand in 2050. So that's the foreseen expected demand. And the total is 600 million tons of demand is foreseen in 2050. You could see it for, the graph shows, demonstrates the demand, expected demand and supply in 2030, 2040, and 2050. So the demand is shown in dark green. If we, for example, pick up the Americas, you could see for 2030, the dark green shows an expected demand of 31 million tons per annum. And the supply is expected to be 33 million tons per annum. So we have a surplus of 2 tons basically in 2030. That's the forecast. And the same goes to 2040, and the same goes to 2050. But if we go, for example, to Asia Pacific, we could see that the demand is 95 in 2030, and the local supply is 93. So 95 versus 93. So we have a deficit of 2 million tons of hydrogen per annum. That's for the all area Pacific countries, includes China, Japan, and South Korea. You could see the breakdown under the area Pacific. So that deficit could be basically an opportunity for Oman to export hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives. That could be a potential market for Oman. Currently, Oman, for example, exports oil, gas, LNG, and it goes to markets in Europe, but also to the Far East, to Japan and South Korea. So we've got already some interesting and strong partnerships developed over the last decades. We can tap into and capitalize for a win-win partnership. Now, speaking about Oman, and this was one of the insights that was coming out from the National Hydrogen Feasibility Study that was done over the last 18 months under the sponsorship of the Ministry of Energy and Minerals, is that Oman starts the hydrogen economy from really a strong position. We've got a lot of hydrocarbon industry in Oman, very established, where we're talking about the upstream, midstream, which includes the infrastructure and the pipelines, more than 4,000 kilometers of pipelines, but also the export. We've got really interesting and very strong partnerships. That's speaking about from the oil and gas perspective. We're also coming big time on the renewables, speaking about the green hydrogen. So we've got an establishing track record, and it's one of the biggest in the region, approaching 4,000 megawatts of renewables, whether it's renewables for power, but also renewables for the applications of power, power to X, including the steam generation. Oman is currently, as I said previously, the third largest producer of hydrogen in the region, with around 1.1 million tons per annum of hydrogen, mostly gray, but also blue. And that strength, that experience and investments can be capitalized upon to really increase and open up new industries for the blue and, of course, turquoise and the green. Since we're talking about the green, and some people might be asking, Oman is a water-stressed country, but yet we're producing some sizable quantities of water from the oil and gas operations. That produced water can be utilized, at least partially, to produce the green hydrogen, whereby we offset some of the feasibility gaps, at least in the initial phase. Oman is believed to be one of the cheapest production costs of green hydrogen in the world. We are very strategically located, for exports all the way to the Far East, but also to Europe, and also to the industries of those countries sitting in the region. So Oman could be also a hub to export to those industries, whether they're Japanese investments or South Koreans, or even investments from the Gulf, but not necessarily based in Oman. We've got an established infrastructure where we have the 4,000 kilometers of gas networks, so that can be tapped into and utilized and leveraged upon. We have also a very efficient electricity network in Oman that we could use to transport the electrons from one place to another. Now, speaking about competitiveness, and there were so much of data and analysis done to really see how Oman and where Oman can play a role in the blue and green hydrogen. This chart shows the production cost, the global production cost of hydrogen in US dollars per kilogram. And for Oman, it shows that the green sliver that you see at the bottom, that Oman is really competitive for both the blue and the green in the coming years, and will be more and more competitive as we move into the soon future. You could see on the bar at the right-hand side, the bottom flag of Oman and Saudis and Australia shows the blue hydrogen, and it shows and confirms Oman is really a very competitive exporter of blue hydrogen to the world. And the same story goes for the green hydrogen, which is you see the second Omani flag on top of that, and shows with the green arrows. So Oman is very much positioned for the blue and for the green as a net exporter to the world, as it has always been as a net exporter for energy. Now, talking about the potential, and this is now going to the hydrogen hubs and what are the next steps. So there is a really great potential to leverage upon the established infrastructure, the industries that are taking place in Oman, the partnerships that we have, whether it's for the oil and gas sector, for the energy sector, for the downstream sector, for the food sector, and of course with the water sector. We can leverage upon that to develop the hydrogen hubs. And the hubs will serve as a great platform upon which the sectors of the nexus, and talking about the nexus and the theme of today, which is the food, water, and energy. So it's a platform for them to integrate, to develop, and of course to stimulate competitiveness. After all, the sectors have to be to go very competitive in their carbon footprint, and that's there's so much talk that was taking place in Paris Agreement throughout the years, and of course recently in the COP26. The platform will serve directly the three pillars, which is energy, water, and food, that are so much, the focus of Oman Vision 2040. The hubs will enable and drive decarbonization agenda, least of which is to really contribute significantly to the national determined contributions of Oman by 2030, and of course leverage upon the existing infrastructure and services, and along with that stimulate investments and strategic partnerships. Now, where do we see the hubs? You could see on the right-hand side the map of Oman. There is a really established industrial hub in Sohar. There's another one in Sor, Duqm, and Salalah, very much diversified. They've got investments in the petrochemicals, in the various industries, in the food, in the water desalination. The same also goes in the inland, so the central part of Oman. We have the RO plants, we have got the oil and gas, we've got the food industries also. So the hubs could develop, as you could see in the circle in the graph. So that area in the north of Oman, covering the port of Sohar, plus also the inland of Oman, where the other industries are taking place. There's another hub that can establish between 𝗆 and the inland of Oman, also with the various industries. A third hub between Duqm and the rest of Oman, and of course Salalah. And there is a big need to really integrate all of those hubs in the mainland of Oman. And that can leverage upon the, again, as I said, the gas networks and the electricity networks, and of course the other industries that are taking place within the inland, for example, like the food industries, Mazoon and others that are really taking place within the northern part of Oman at least. So the steps to really mature those hubs, the way we see them are, a three-step approach. The first one is that we kickstart the partnerships to establish those national hubs, and that will include creating partnerships, putting in place the initial building blocks for the hydrogen value chain. It's so important to really build the value chains, to really keep that competitiveness for the long run, and kickstart the pilots and demonstrators. And then, of course, we move to step 2, which is scale up the projects and strengthen the supply chains. And that, that includes, building on the profile that we develop on the first step, and that we expand the supply chains and the ecosystems to really unlock the international export markets. And of course, we expand the infrastructure if necessary. And then we move to step 3, whereby we scale the exports and monetize the decarbonization potentials through the CCUS, so that's carbon capture, utilization, and storage, whereby we can establish more clusters, more hubs to produce synthetic fuels, downstream chemicals, expand international partnerships, and ensure Oman emerges as a key center for hydrogen and low carbon fuels in the world. And that's through the decarbonization and capturing the CO2 and other GHG emissions components. The indicative dates that we see that we should aim to establish the partnerships in 2022. So that's basically now. And then we move on to scale up in 2025 or so. And then we should have the matured infrastructure and future business profile, mature partnerships, matured clusters in 2030. There are already established avenues and established dialogues to really govern and oversee how this develops. And for one is the 𝗲𝗆𝗍𝗍, is a national hydrogen alliance that is founded by 15 stakeholders in the country. And the idea is exactly that, is to establish the partnerships and mature businesses. There is also the national hydrogen strategy that will be announced soon by the government. And there is a national energy model where it can be used as a very efficient tool to guide the development process of establishing the hydrogen hubs. So that's basically what I wanted to showcase. The key messages from my side is that hydrogen is coming up and coming up very strongly. Oman is really well positioned to leverage upon the expertise that we have developed over the years, the expertise and the partnerships with the international markets to really establish low carbon hydrogen hubs in Oman. And the establishment of that, can and shall include the nexus, so that's the water sector, the food sector, and obviously the energy sector. So strengthen those partnerships. And of course, partnership means that we have to define where do we start with the pilots and demonstrators, and that we can build up and scale on that. As we move on to doing so, we need to think of the value chains so that we keep our industries very competitive and sustainable over the years to come. Later today that you'll hear also a presentation from my colleague, Dr. Khalil, who will talk about how do we see those collaboration and how this energy renewal will take shape, and what are the potential collaboration avenues to really get this going moving forward. Thank you so much for the listening. I'm more than happy to receive your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah, for that very comprehensive presentation. You've covered a lot of ground. We do have the chat room open. If anyone has any questions for Abdullah, please do type away and I'll keep an eye on that. Dr. Abdullah, I'll start with a question of my own, if that's all right. You talked a lot about the process of, how the hydrogen infrastructure, the plans for it, and what's been achieved so far in terms of positioning Oman as a supplier to the world, as an exporter, leveraging current partnerships that you have already on the oil front, etc. Much has been made in this hydrogen argument about securing demand. Of course, we have to look at how we're supplying the hydrogen, but that the investment that is going to go into that, that's already being put into that, must feel secure, that the demand is there on the other side. And you highlighted a few points on the global map there where there may be actually a lack of supply in certain cases in terms of projections. But one argument that's been made, especially for the GCC countries looking at hydrogen development, is that they should secure local demand first, your local industries, to take on the first batch, if you like. From a cost point of view, it probably would make sense, and otherwise, and from a pilot point of view. So where does the government of Oman stand on that front in terms of incentivizing local industry to start using this hydrogen?
Great question, Daria. And indeed, creating local demand is a natural first step in the hydrogen journey. Over the last 18 months, there was immense discussion on, what are the sectors that Oman can really focus on and develop the demand. And obviously, as the logic says, that we've got to, start with the sectors that utilize the hydrogen in the first place now. So the potential to substitute the gray hydrogen with blue and of course, green. So that's a lot of discussion is taking place in that. Also, alongside is, what if we capture the CO2, if we're going to really go blue hydrogen, for example, in the industrial setups, once we capture the CO2, what kind of new chemicals and synthetic fuels that we can consider producing in Oman that have initially market size in Oman, for oil and gas operations, for the enhanced oil recovery applications and others. So that's all. There's already discussion and dialogue taking place on that front. There is an interest to develop demand for the mobility sector, so utilizing hydrogen for the trucks, for example. There is a demand, there is some discussion, although it's still premature, to utilize hydrogen for the power generation, but that's very premature. One of the really good opportunities that were discussed during the work is, can we blend the green hydrogen into the gas networks? So whereby we tap into the existing networks and we blend, we go stepwise, so maybe 3%, 5 and 10. But with that, we create that momentum, we create something scalable, and of course, we can build upon. Lots of specialized studies, very detailed studies were done on each of those, including the one for demand. So the study looked at, what will be the potential impact integrity-wise on the pipelines itself, so on the network itself, but also on the off-takers. Will they be forced to change anything? And the outcomes that we see is that blending is very much safe until certain percentages. So back to the point, there is a lot of discussion and a lot of interest, and I'm sure that you'll hear a lot of projects coming up on creating the local demand simultaneously as we also eye the international markets.
Okay,
on the incentives part, for the industry to create and move into that part.
Yeah.
Also, a detailed and thorough integration with the stakeholders was done, and the team has identified 28 incentives and strategic enablers. They were classified into Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And Tier 1 being the most urgent, most impactful. So the government is trying to work with the stakeholders to really get those incentives in place so that we could see accelerated transition towards the blue, turquoise, and green hydrogen.
Okay, thanks, Dr. And you've partially answered one of the questions up here on our chat, which is, can the existing gas pipeline network be used for hydrogen transport? So that question you've just sort of answered. I have another couple of questions here, which is very general on how big an investment is required to realize this vision that you've described. And then I'll give you the other question while we're at it so we can get that answered in the time that we have, which is an interesting one. How many hubs can there be for hydrogen in the region? We know that the UAE, for example, has serious plans as well in place and partnerships already in terms of projects, Saudi Arabia similarly. So is a first mover advantage?
I think I lost your voice, Dalia. Dalia?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know at what point you lost me. I was just
you said hubs in the region.
Exactly. So I mean, Oman is obviously quite advanced in its planning, as are others in the region. Is there room for more than one hub for export, if you like, in the GCC?
The short answer is yes. The same way we're approaching the oil and gas, all the GCC countries are producing oil and gas in one way or another. So the demand for energy is ever increasing, for many reasons, for the increasing, industrialization, urbanization, and more energy access to the world. So the demand is there, and I guess, there is no harm to build that competitiveness and competition in the region. Oman is, as I said, is advancing in the hydrogen agenda. How many hubs we can establish in Oman? And again, we could start with a couple or so, and then we can build upon, obviously. But to establish the hubs, to establish the hydrogen business in Oman, to serve, as a new vector in the energy portfolio for Oman, that's fundamental. But also to integrate with the nexus, with the water and the food, as they're also so much directly, indirectly, linked to the energy, and there's a lot of opportunities for mutual collaboration.
Okay, there's a question here on legislation, basically, but global legislation. Is that a constraint on hydrogen usage going forward, in terms of how that's going to be regulated? Let's say, is there a need for a coordinated regulatory environment for hydrogen? And if there is, how prepared Oman is Oman on that front?
Great question. Indeed, there is a need for global cooperation and coordination for many reasons. Is that the least of which is to really get that understanding developed for what blue is blue and how blue can be defined, and how turquoise can be defined, and how green can be defined. Where do we start? So there is a global certification system has to be established. As we also move into the global momentum for the carbon trading, carbon credits, I think that establishing that system and getting the system clear to everybody would stimulate the low carbon fuels, and that's the intention of the talk today. How far Oman is moving? We've got dialogues with the key stakeholders, and we continue to have the dialogues. Oman has established some already partnerships and memorandum of understandings with some of the countries to really focus on the legislations, at least starting bilaterally first. So how can we define? Do we start defining for example, the green from the production phase, or do we also include the transportation and the shipments? Do we include also the conversion and reconversion on the other side? So that dialogue is taking place. And obviously, it's not something easy as you could imagine, but it's shaping up.
Okay, and Dr. Abdullah, I hope you can still hear me. Yep, my microphone is on. In terms of the technology that's obviously being put forward towards hydrogen so far, there's a lot of R&D going on. Oman has a very developed academia infrastructure in country. How much cooperation do you think there needs to be between academia and industry going forward to sort of further reduce the costs of these processes that have been experimented with so far? And is academia involved in Oman on this particular solution?
Yeah, there's great, need. I wouldn't say interest, but there's great need for the academia and research institutions to be part of the journey, to build up momentum and also address some of the technical challenges, technological, economical, and social challenges that might be coming along with the journey. They were so much part of the hydrogen economy feasibility work and part of the steering committee. PDO and the industry in Oman, the Ministry of Energy and Minerals, have also established platforms to really tap into the expertise in academia, on certain specialized subjects. So that's already taken care of. So there is a lot of dialogue taking place. There is a lot of interest to really develop centers of excellences, very specialized on the hydrogen.
Well, Dr. Abdullah, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've reached the end of our time. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation on hydrogen hubs.